So, welcome everyone in whatever time zone you are. Today we're looking at the future of education, how teaching, learning and research is changing as a result of the pandemic, and how the education sector could change over the coming decade. Now, we can't promise to solve the problems of the world in an hour, but we'll take a broad overview and we'll pick out some things that seem to us to be particularly interesting. As I say, please do feel free to add questions or add comments, and we'll try to pick those up as we go along and do a roundup at the end. Just to introduce myself, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Eliot Wilson, one of the founders of the Pivot Point. I spent more than 10 years in the public sector as a senior official in the House of Commons, and then I moved into reputation management and strategy in the private sector. I write for a number of publications here in the UK and in the US. And later on, I'll be handing over to my colleagues, Christian Hunt and Mark Heywood. So first of all, I want to have a look at where we are currently. September, of course, is back to school and back to college for most students. And the world has changed almost beyond recognition since their predecessor cohort arrived in September 2019. Schools and universities have been closed for months, and those that have returned had done so gradually, and are operating under strict conditions of hygiene and social distancing. The physical learning environment is very different. You just can't have a classroom of 20 or 30 pupils or a lecture hall of 200 students. And particularly for younger children, teachers have to rethink any close proximity and physical contact because of the danger of infection. No one wants their school to be the one which makes the headlines for incubating a new outbreak of coronavirus, with all the terrible consequences that that would bring. Students have had a very different experience. Remote learning has been their focus, and the screen fixation has been as much a part of their lives as it has been, I suspect, for all of us. But we need to be aware of the granularity of the overall picture. Not everyone has easy, instant, and personal access to the internet on a device of their own. And for many families, remote learning will have been a matter of juggling priorities and apportioning access as required. We also need to realise that very few pupils will have been putting in a full school day in the way that they would if they were physically on the premises. I think any of us would start to get tired if we sat in front of a screen for 6, 7 or 8 hours a day without significant breaks. There is a real thing called Zoom fatigue, as we know, and there's been research which suggests that investing that much of your attention and your time into any kind of discourse is genuinely more wearing and more tiring than it is if you do it in person. Now, college students, of course, are different. They can, depending on their institution, both expect and receive much less face-to-face contact in a normal working week. If I think back to when I was an undergraduate, it could be as little as 6 or 7 hours a week, never mind a day. Independent study is an integral part of the university experience, and that, in relative terms, has been able to continue unchanged. Students may even have found lectures delivered by Zoom more fulfilling and more interactive than sitting in a large auditorium. But what lockdown has done for pupils, but even more so for students who are traditionally gregarious, is to remove the aspect of socialisation from the education experience. We've become a society atomised by the pandemic, shut away in our family groups, unable even to break out for the mildest of socialising until very recently. And of course, we know that certainly in the UK, that's going to change again next week when more restrictions are introduced to deal with renewed outbreaks. Now, how institutions rebuild that sense of community, how far it's possible without a COVID vaccine, and how far it's desirable is up for grabs. And that's something that Mark will be addressing a bit later. But we should all be thinking about the pedagogic relationship more widely too. COVID, for all its destructive power, has given us a blank canvas. So how do you want to construct a new connection with the young people you're teaching? Or if you're a student, what do you want from your teacher or professor? What do you need? And importantly, what do you think you deserve? One of the developments we've noticed in many sectors and professions is an increased personalisation. Now that could well be true of education too. why should institutions offer one model for every pupil or student? If you're making greater use of technology, that allows you to have a much more customized relationship on both sides of the equation. Students can find a way of learning that suits them best, and educators can tailor their delivery to their strengths and preferences in terms of content, style, and pace. The retreat from the traditional physical environment of school, college, or university also asks huge questions. This is an ideal time to revisit estate strategies and review what you own. Are you set up in the best way to deliver your core focus? Can you do it better? And inevitably, can you do it more efficiently? Now, change shouldn't be cost-driven in an ideal world, but we all have to operate within budgets, and it may be that there are savings to be made. Then there's the issue of access and diversity. Access, not just in a physical sense, though that's important, but also in terms of allowing pupils and students from all sorts of backgrounds to get the maximum out of the opportunities you're offering. This is, and should be, a campaign that never ends, but now is the time for big questions. Who do you want to attract? In what numbers? What are the current barriers, and how many of them can you help to break down? Are they physical, financial, social, cultural? Inevitably, they're going to be a mixture. And what have the changes wrought by the pandemic done to alter your perspective and to show you new opportunities? Now, we understand that a lot of institutions and a lot of students have to see things through a brutally financial lens. Let's be honest, those are the harsh realities of the sector, and they're not going to get any easier in the foreseeable future. We all know that there are huge disparities of wealth in the education world, and Harvard's endowment will remain a world away from the resources of a post-1992 British university. Now that enjoins us to ask if there are other ways that institutions can bring about game-changing improvements. But this can also be an opportunity to rethink the way we pay for education. All bureaucracies have an inherent inertia, and the education sector is no different. How often do arguments in academia boil down to, that's the way we've always done it? Our proposition is that there will never be a better time to challenge that lazy thinking. We can do things differently, start wholly ab initio, and the question why is answered with why not in a way that has rarely had more force. Mark, Christian, and I founded Pivot Point on the proposition that change is coming to the world, to business, to academia, to public services, and to society. That's unavoidable. So why not embrace it, face it head on, and use it to look thoroughly at yourself and the way you work, and prepare yourself for the next decade and beyond. We're excited by the opportunities we can see out there, and we make no apology for carrying a kind of optimism bias. There doesn't seem much point in approaching the world in any other way right now. Why mourn the loss of what was when you can use the chance to make something new, to create your own pivot point? That's what we do and what we want to help people do. So enough from me as a broad overview. I'll now hand over to my colleague Christian, who's going to talk about his specialism of human behaviour and how we should see the world of education through that prism. Christian, over to you.
Thank you. As Eliot has outlined, the current situation poses several challenges, or as we prefer to think of them, opportunities for academic institutions. And I want to begin with some good news, because on the face of it, academia is well placed to handle a situation that requires creative thinking. After all, institutions that teach us how to think, understand the world around us, and solve societal problems ought to have the cognitive ability to solve their own. Academic establishments have ready access to fresh thinking. Who better to understand and tap into the thoughts of Gen Z and millennials than the very people that have seen them through large swathes of their formative years? And education is also a sector that's well used to facing competition. Schools compete for pupils, rankings, and results, while universities compete for students, academics, funding, and prestige. The Ivy League is a league in both senses of the word, a group that combines to cooperate, but also a Premier League of fierce rivals. And as we've seen under lockdown, learning is also heavily in demand. No one that we should pay any serious attention to is suggesting that there should be any less education in the world. If anything, COVID has illustrated the benefits of knowledge, understanding, and critical thinking. But of course, it's not that simple. If there's one thing we know from behavioral science, it's that we're all susceptible to poor decision making. Even the smartest amongst us fall prey to the flaws in human thinking. Cognitive biases that served our ancestors well in simple environments can lead us to draw the wrong conclusions entirely in the far more volatile and complex one we're faced with in the 21st century. And much as the dynamics I've just outlined do genuinely offer strategic advantages to those institutions able to take advantage of them, there are many reasons why an academic mindset might not be best equipped to handle the current situation. So what aspects of the mental models prevalent in the education sector might hold them back? Well, quite a few, it turns out, and I'm just going to cover 3 of them. Firstly, in English and other languages, we talk about going to school or university, and we think of them as physical locations, because that's how they've traditionally been seen. Much like bank branches, school buildings are long-standing physical manifestations of history and survival. Yet thanks to COVID, they're not necessarily a strategic advantage when it comes to digital delivery of education. Thinking of a school or university as a place might not just be the wrong frame. It can also act as a cognitive anchor that weighs down our thinking and only permits the contemplation of solutions that are seen to efficiently use existing physical spaces. Then there's the structure of academic life. It's very institutionalized. We're all used to the idea of having 3 terms or semesters a year with a long summer break. But that structure wasn't designed with optimized learning in mind. It's a relic from when farming took precedence over the other aspects of life. The logic for the timing of the start of the school year was to ensure that children were free to help with the harvest over the summer and early autumn. A logic that no longer applies, yet it still dictates the academic calendar. Equally, the way subjects are taught is based on a logical construct. We learn history separately from geography, literature, and language. But you can't learn about the Second World War just by looking at what happened when. You also need to understand the how and the why. And my own discipline of behavioral science offers a lesson in how academic categorizations can be really unhelpful. Behavioral science emerged as people began to look at the intersections of economics and psychology and realized that there were inconsistencies between the way economic models predicted people ought to behave and the way they actually did. Of course, the emergence of the field is an excellent illustration of how change can happen in academia. Now, I'm not suggesting that all academic institutions have their hands tied by legacy or that they're incapable of change. Rather, that there are some serious cognitive challenges when it comes to unpicking a model that's been around for a long time, particularly when many of those who run that model have literally grown up in it and not seen anything else. Of course, the challenge here is to avoid throwing out the proverbial baby with the bathwater. The cognitive biases that might hold us back from innovative thinking are there for a reason. And some aspects of education as it currently stands are genuinely tried, tested, and fit for purpose. On the flip side, radical thinking doesn't have to mean radical change. A centuries-old Oxford College would be crazy to suddenly turn itself into a hotel and go 100% online. But equally, presuming that everything's been handed down from prior generations is automatically a good thing won't help identify the best possible solutions. So here's a technique that I use with my clients who are facing difficult choices. It's based on the words of a famous doctor, and we know how much academics love doctors. That doctor is Dr. Pepper, purveyor of a well-known fizzy drink. Those of you old enough to remember the 90s might remember that the drink had a slogan, Dr. Pepper, what's the worst that can happen? And that's the question I recommend that academic establishments ask themselves. Not just about new ideas for how they might approach the challenges they're facing, but also for the status quo. Because what that question flushes out are the downsides of a particular decision. And all too often, we think of change as being risky, but not changing also comes with risk. And when you've got lots of reasons to cling to a model you've been running for years, if not decades and centuries, it's essential to put that through the same scrutiny as the new ideas. With that said, I'll hand over to Mark, who's going to share some ways that we can think about the way forward.
Christian, thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, depending on where you are in the world. Fascinating listening to my colleagues Eliot and Christian talk. Everything they've said is true. And for me, the really interesting bit is that's kind of always been the case. We frame a lot of what is happening at the moment through the lens of COVID. And don't get me wrong, COVID is responsible for a great deal, but it's not responsible for a lot of what has just been spoken about. I'll give you an example, and I know there are some listeners and some viewers that are watching from outside of the UK, but those from inside the UK will be very well aware of the recent A-level results fiasco, for the want of a better word. For those of you outside of the UK, just a very quick précis. Critical exams that are done for people that are about to leave what we would call school and go to college/university couldn't happen for obvious reasons. So the initial solution was that the grades for the exams they couldn't take would be simply based on the predicted grades that their teachers and assessors had already put into the system. The government ignored that advice and went instead with an algorithm that had been created by the educational governing body in this particular country. When that came out, it had serious problems in that it put people from poorer areas at a clear disadvantage. So the government backtracked and went back to the original solution, which was the teacher predicted grades. It caused a huge amount of disruption. Fingers were pointed all over the place. Students had high levels of anxiety, not knowing what results they were going to get. Places that were offered at colleges and universities were withdrawn and they were back on the table again. Some people had to defer, etc., etc. But COVID didn't cause any of that. It was simply the prism through which that manifested itself as a breakdown in the algorithm, the analysis that was provided to government, the decisions that government made and then went back on. All of the press reaction had nothing to do with COVID. A lot of what we're going to talk about today in the Q&A, and I've got one eye on you, one eye on my notes, and one eye on the Q&A session down here, is this. If you frame this problem purely through the lens of COVID, you may not get the right list of problems that you need to solve. So let's start. I want to talk about a couple of things. Let's start with narrative and perception. How do we frame the problems? Now, Eliot alluded to this earlier. We have a bunch of young people who would normally be going off to university, to Christian's phrase, that going to university. That's a clear part of your formative years. You leave home probably for the first time, you go to a new town or city, you make new friends, and you start your grown-up adult life. Now we are, if you listen to the narrative, robbing young children of that experience, the experience that I had, that Eliot had, and that Christian had. And actually, that's true. In some cases, that is true. Students are not allowed those opportunities at the moment because of COVID. But if we frame it purely through COVID, that's the only narrative we actually experience. Let me give you a flip argument. Let's go back to what Eliot talked about. Let's go back to the intake of September 2019. For a considerable number of that intake, leaving home for the first time to go to a new town or city, to meet new people and start a new life, induced high amounts of anxiety. We don't really hear those stories, nor do we hear stories. We hear stories of people who, for example, have thrived at university, have gone on to have huge careers, be industry leaders in their chosen field. We rarely hear about people who get to college and university and realize that the subject they thought they wanted to study is actually wrong for them. They want to change. They want to move to a subject and a course and a set of experiences that will make them happy. But how easy do we as institutions in education make it for those people? We rarely hear about those stories. And so when we think about the future of education, if you just look at it through a COVID lens, you'll get a very clear set of problems. But if you only address those problems, you run the risk of missing the opportunities that Eliot talked about to fix, to rethink, to move forward in the future. You also miss what I think is a huge trick as an educator of young people. You miss the chance to be a part of the rest of their life if you only focus on being part of their life for a few short years early on in their particular life. If you think about the relationship that you want with your customer, to reframe the narrative, surely you want them to be a repeat customer. You want to have a lifelong relationship with them, not just simply a place that they went to when they were younger and a completely different person way back then. As Christian said, it's really, really important to challenge yourselves and what you believe in, because if you were to set up your institution and your offering from scratch, would you do it the way you do it today, or would you do it differently, knowing everything that you know and everything that you've learned through what COVID exposed and was there beforehand? Because if you would do it differently, you probably should. And this webinar is not going to give, we can't solve all of the problems in half an hour and then 20 minutes of questions. But what we can do is hopefully shine a light on things that will make you think a little bit differently. So here's another one. I'm a firm believer that education and academia are two different things. Education, as we know, is not something that stops at the end of our academic career, which is usually over if you go through the normal model and you stop, say, for example, either at your high school exams, or you maybe go to university and do an undergraduate degree. Wherever you stop your formal academic learning, that isn't when education for you stops. It continues. It continues through things like this webinar, all the webinars that we've been on over the last few months, the books we read, the podcasts we listen to, the newspapers and the journals that we pay money to subscribe to. It is a lifelong exercise in educating ourselves. And I wonder how many academic institutions are set up to exploit that. Because if you only focus on academic learning, there's a huge market out there that's going completely untapped that you could, if you wanted to, plug into. Online learning has exploded, but that was true before COVID. There are so many courses out there at the moment. It's often difficult to find what it is you want, but whatever it is you want, it could be anything. It could be deep sea fishing. It could be cookery. It could be archery. Whatever it is, there is a course out there for you. And if you think about your own academic institution, if it has a rich history that stretches back over a long period of time, well, the chances are that people that are interested in history, like me, might be prepared to pay money to learn about that, to learn from you about that, or in lockdown, to virtually walk around that environment. Museums, art galleries are a very good example that education could learn from in lockdown. Their subscriber numbers to their websites went through the roof because people wanted to virtually walk around. There's an opportunity, I think, there for educators. Now, I'm going to drop a couple of names in here, and other providers are available. But if we think about online educators, we think about websites like Skillshare or masterclass.com. Academically, they don't make any sense. And they don't make sense academically because they are usually fronted by presenters that have little or no formal teaching experience. But let's look at masterclass.com. If that were a showstopper, the show would have stopped already, but it isn't, because the model is very, very compelling. The model is famous person A teaches subject B. It's very clever. If you look at their offering, it has everything from dog training to barbecue skills, to cookery skills, to interior design, photography, filmmaking, personal growth, motivation, meditation. You have a look at their website, they offer thousands of courses, and they do really interesting things. Now, I'm not a teacher, but that doesn't stop me from being able to share what I know and hopefully point to learning opportunities that people may think, actually, that's quite interesting. I can learn about that. Academically, doesn't make sense. From an ongoing lifelong education, it's really, really compelling. So how far are educational institutions, particularly academic ones, set up to maybe partner with people like masterclass.com? There's nothing to stop you. Well, maybe there is. We'll come back to that. But there's little to stop you from partnering with them. Could you share content? Could you share lecturers, professors, doctors, researchers with them? Could you invite them into your rich history premise that looks fantastic on camera to give a very special one-off masterclass based in your environment? And that sounds like pie in the sky, but there's a really, really important lesson that I think educational institutions could learn here. Let's flip the narrative. Let's imagine that we're in a masterclass.com editorial/board meeting. If they're not considering coming after the academic world, I'd be very, very surprised. Now, there are rules and regulations in place that currently stop that. But imagine if diversification on that scale became a thing and national governments allowed people like masterclass.com to drift very seamlessly, very authentically in a narrative that made sense, from dog training to interior design to cookery to filmmaking to photography to the history of World War II, how and why it started, to eventually further down the line, an undergraduate degree in history. What would that mean for the future of education? What would that mean for your institution? And let's flip it and talk about the customer, as Christian said. What if you're a student, a customer, a consumer of all of this potential material? Which one would you prefer? Would you go down the masterclass.com route and then potentially replace the formative learning experience elsewhere? Or would you do what's always been done? The point is we don't know, but the point absolutely is we have to challenge what we think is right about the model that we've got. So diversification on a grand scale could be coming further down the line. Then finally, community, and it links back to what Eliot said earlier, and also to online providers. Online providers are very, very skilled at the creation of a community, even though there is no physical premise that can contain all of their clients. And actually, they probably wouldn't want one, because this community is vast. Not only do they offer thousands of courses, they have hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of customers. Whilst it's not an academic or an educational institution, Peloton.com provides services related to fitness to 2.5 million people. And it has very cleverly created a sense of community that exists or existed in person in the studios when they were open, but also online. It's tapped into a brand new market of people that would not traditionally pay money for the traditional services that were offered by Spin Studios. Every TED Talk is another good example. Every TED Talk has a community. And when we go online and we watch TED Talks, we watch things that we know nothing about, that we've probably never even heard of. And we do so willingly because we know that we're following a brand that we trust and that has created a sense of community. A lot of people that give TED Talks are not formally trained teachers. They have interesting things to say about the world, and they provide an educational experience that goes way beyond an academic learning experiences. Now, we called this webinar The Future of Education. That was the first part of it, and that was deliberate because I fundamentally believe that education and academia are separate things. And if we only look through the prism of COVID and only look through the prism of academia, we might not come up with the right solution for our future. I think it's all up for grabs, whether you are a learner or a teacher, a consumer of these products, or a provider of these products. The future is potentially huge in terms of what you can do. But I would urge you to remember one thing. That's always been the case. COVID has been a very ugly, tragic, and heartbreaking bump along the road. All the problems that we had before, we may still have moving forward. We just have to challenge ourselves to think differently about how we do that. I know there's been some activity on the chat box because I can see it going up and down. So what I'll do now is I'll pause there and give us some time to dive into this a little bit further. So Eliot, can I hand back to you and we'll jump into some Q&A?
Thanks very much, Mark. I think we've raised a lot of topics there in just over half an hour. Inevitably, there's a lot to talk about, a lot we'd like to expand on, and we won't have time for everything. But yes, we are getting some questions in. So if I can kick off with the first question, and this is really to anyone on the panel who wants to take it. The questioner says, assuming that changes need to happen, where do we start and at what level? Christian, do you want to kick off there?
Look, I think it's a great question, because what we've posed is a massive challenge, and of course, massive challenges have to start somewhere. And one of the things I think is fascinating is there is no right answer to this, which means that you have an opportunity to really tackle small things or big things. And I would turn around to institutions and say, look, I think in the same way that other businesses, and we should continually remember that academic institutions are businesses, as Mark was highlighting. You know, you can choose to sort of do small things, you can choose to do big things, but the question is, you know, what are you up for? What are you able to do? How much appetite within the organization is there for change? And I think one of the key things is to identify things that genuinely you've always known are problems, because I think this is a great opportunity to get things out of the cupboard that have sort of been put in the too difficult box and not really addressed and tackled. And I think there's a lovely opportunity here to really tackle some big things. But all of that said, there are some smaller pieces as well that one can start to look at. And I think very small changes, and it's one of the tricks of behavioral science, is very small changes can have a huge impact. So it isn't necessarily about saying we have to revolutionize tomorrow. But I think I'd be looking to say which parts of the processes that we run just don't quite feel right. Where can we really start to change? And I think if you start to permit those sorts of discussions, interesting ideas will flow, because very often, particularly where people have been with an institution for some time, they'll know where things aren't right and things aren't working. And I think this is a great opportunity to bring those discussions to the fore. So I would say, rather than someone external coming in and pointing out where the flaws are, there's a very strong case to be made for people internally to focus and to kind of give an opportunity for people to air things that they might not have, things they've sort of accepted because that's the way it had to be. And I think if you start to deal with those things internally and it becomes an intrinsically motivated exercise, there's a greater chance of having some change, because if it feels like it's being imposed externally, that the changes are being done because somebody from the outside said it's a good idea, that is going to be harder to deliver. And so I would start with, what do people within the institution, if they're given the opportunity, really feel that they can change and they want to change?
Eliot, if I may, just on that one, I completely agree, Christian, and there's perhaps a couple of points, but from the same conversation that I had recently, to the point that you made, Christian, about the way that we teach history. I recently interviewed a gentleman by the name of Professor Vincent Brown, who's the head of African and African American Studies at Harvard. And it was about a book that he'd written about the slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade. And we discussed some of the problems that existed within the way that traditionally we've taught history, which is from a nation state perspective. We tend to confine the teaching of things like history to borders, which means, as Christian said, we understand what happened, but we don't necessarily understand why. You can't approach issues like COVID or climate change, or in the conversation that I had with Professor Brown, slavery, purely from within national borders. So not only do we have to think about the future of the demand for our product, we might have to think about the product as well. That was the first part of the conversation, which really is a rallying cry to say, what do you offer today? Now, if you're an academic institution, there will be constraints about how much you can change, because you may be guided or pressured by the national curriculum or the courses that the exam boards will expect you to deliver. But if you're not, if you're the provider of education services that are more generic, you have a huge amount that you can do, but you must always, whatever you do, is re-examine whether your product continues to make sense to your consumer. And on the consumer side of it, on the customer side of it, shifting demographics, the move to online, is only one aspect of the problem and the opportunity that educational and institutions will face. In the conversation I had with Professor Brown, which if you want to, we can send you a link to it because it is very interesting, I raised the point of the Commonwealth nations. There are 54 nations in the Commonwealth that have a total population of 2.6 billion people. The statistic for you here is that 60% of those 2.6 billion people are under the age of 30. Now, they look at the world very differently to the way I look at it now, and even the way I looked at it when I was their age. That consumer base, that potential customer of yours has a particular way of thinking and a particular expectation. And not only do we need to understand and re-examine the products that we offer them, we need to understand the products that they actually want. So what we were going to do after this webinar is divert traffic to the podcast, where we're going to be flipping the narrative a little bit. We're going to be interviewing consumers of educational services and academic products to see, actually, what do you want? What are you looking for? What do you wish you could study that you can't potentially study? So I think, you know, to the question, it's as simple as, you don't necessarily need to throw everything out, but just have a look at what you offer and ask, does it continue to make sense given what I know about my customer? And if you don't know enough about your customer, that's okay. You can become an expert in your customer pretty quickly. Maybe you don't ask them what they want. Maybe you ask them what they're prepared to pay for. But that's not a unique one-off exercise. That's something I think we all need to keep continually coming back to kick it, to challenge it, and to say, does this still make sense given everything that's going on in the world and the problems that we always had in the background? What can we do about them? Sorry, Elliot, I just wanted to jump in and make that point while it was fresh in my mind.
No, absolutely. Thanks very much, Mark. I think the only two things I'd add to that are, firstly, on your point, Mark, of finding out your customers' needs or your consumers' needs. I think there are three important points which I alluded to when I was opening. And I think you have to ask implicitly or explicitly of your pupils, students, learners, whatever you want to call them. You have to ask them what they want, what they need, but also I think, and I say this with a reputation management hat on, what they think they deserve. Because one of the things that has been true in British universities, certainly over the past 15 years, probably since the introduction of tuition fees, is that the relationship between provider and consumer has changed hugely. Students who go to university now, except in Scotland, are paying fees and are paying ever increasing fees. And that has given them a very different slant on what they think they should be getting for it. Not true of everyone, of course. Some students will still maintain the sort of traditional stereotype life of lying in bed till 2 in the afternoon and spending most of their days in the pub. I'm sure that's still true. But I think it has changed the dynamic, and it does mean that they have greater expectations, which are to an extent intrinsically based on the image that the university, the college, whatever the provider is, projects. The other thing I'd say, going back to the question of where should change start, I think you have to look at education from a perspective which is, on the one hand, conceptual, but on the other hand, quite brutally product focused. You've got to look at what the purpose of education is, but what the purpose of your part in that journey is. In this country, for example, we have 3 distinct points of ejection, if you like. We get pupils to 16 when they take their GCSEs traditionally. We then push some on to 18 when they take their A-levels or the baccalaureate or whatever it is. And then you've got the higher education sector where they go on to take an undergraduate degree and then perhaps further degrees. So there is this cut-off point for each of those stages. And I think the answer to how much you can change and from where the change is going to come does depend to a great extent on what part of that chain you are. If you're preparing people for sitting their GCSEs or any kind of exam that you take at roughly 16, there is going to be an element of simply getting them to that line in as satisfactory a state as you can. And, you know, I talked a little bit, and maybe we can talk a bit more about this later, about resources, the pressures on resources and finances. And I think we've got to be careful as we sit here talking about an idealized world of the groves of academia and how it can be reconceptualized, that for some educators and for some students, this is a pretty stark process of getting through to an end point where you finish. But I think you've got to ask yourself, what part of the chain am I servicing? What's my beginning and end point? And to whom am I answerable apart from my consumers? So universities are answerable to a different authority from secondary schools. Further education colleges will have their own accountability. And I think that's going to be a question you need to ask quite fundamentally before you start to understand how you can interact into a system of change. But, you know, we are left with the fact that we have a spectrum between a wholly state-controlled system of education and a wholly free market. And I think probably most jurisdictions fall somewhere on that line, and you can adjust according to taste. But that's going to make a big difference as to how you change. So you need to look at, I suppose, the dynamics of who can make you change, how you can change for your pupils, students, customers, whatever you want to call them, and also how much change you feel comfortable with, to go back to Christian's point. So I hope that's given some answer to the idea of where we change. Another question, how about the opportunities to export, selling online education from the UK internationally? Mark, again, do you want to talk about that a little bit? Because you were talking about potential.
Sure, I can try. And to the point you just made, Eliot, about particularly in the academic world, there are limits and restrictions on what is permissible from a state perspective. However, let's assume that those things can be challenged or overcome or massaged or changed in some way. The actual industry that we're in now becomes irrelevant if we're thinking about exporting and going online. That simply, the what we do, that simply conditions how we actually go about doing it. The fact is, if we're trying to reach an international market, again, a lot of institutions, a lot of academic ones have always done that. You know, they've always had students from abroad. Typically, they've charged them higher fees to be, of course, of that. It's a huge source of revenue. Now, currently, as things stand, people can't fly all over the world, so that's a challenge. But the online market is huge, and the danger is that if you don't start to embrace it or think about partnering, then change will happen around you. The likes of Skillshare and Masterclass could quite easily come up with a solution that, in the same way that Apple layered the music industry, could potentially deeply disrupt the education industry. However, just because you're constrained from a regulation perspective by offering your courses online and diversifying, that may be true. The what you offer doesn't need to be what you currently offer. You can have and add more products to it. A lot of institutions, particularly in the UK and indeed the US, will already partner with local businesses. They will already have relations in the local community. There's nothing to stop those relationships expanding. And you already do it to a certain extent. You already have, particularly in the academic world, the notion of peer review, just as it exists in the medical world. You couldn't put an article, or you shouldn't put an article or a paper into the Lancet without it having been discussed by a considerable number of peers. It's the same in the academic world. Anything that comes out from a research perspective will typically go to that wider community. So that sense of collaboration has always been there. What we're trying to address now is, how do you reach a much wider audience? Well, again, if you were to create your business and your institution from scratch, it probably wouldn't be, to the point that Eliot made, just your venerable institution in terms of bricks and mortar. That's clearly an important part of your institution, but the size of the online market is absolutely staggering. And no doubt you will work for an institution that has a certain cachet, that whose name means something. If you're an Ivy League institution, if you're an Oxford college, that doesn't matter. You could be a local community college and not an Ivy League and still have cachet. It's how do you leverage that in an online perspective. But don't assume that what you currently offer as a product will work online, but also don't assume that you can't create something new. What do people who have a certain cachet with your institution actually want? Why would they come to you versus going elsewhere? Well, a lot of that has to do with the product that you offer, the way you offer it, the way you make it accessible to them. It's simply a case of saying, what do we do today, and why do we do it, and what do we stand for, and what could we do? And if we haven't got the skills that allow us to put stuff online, well, who can we partner with to get the skills? You know, you don't have to have all of the answers yourselves. You don't employ people because you're better than them at doing it. You employ them because they're better at you than doing it. And then you hire them and you set yourself up for success. There's nothing really to stop you having introductory talks with anybody that you think might be able to help you put this stuff online. We can have, you know, offline debates about the specifics of moving online, but I would be staggered that if we looked at this in 10 years' time, the amount of academic learning that had moved online was not significantly more than it is now. Yes, there are challenges to it, but it doesn't have to be academic learning. It could be education of all sorts. Just because you don't offer dog training skills today doesn't mean you won't be doing it in years' time. And yes, that is a thing. If you go on masterclass.com, there is an expert who will teach you how to train your dog from the comfort of your living room. I don't have a dog, so I don't know whether it works, but the very fact that it's there proves that there's a market for it. And quite often it may be the old adage that if you build it, they will come, they will find you because you're offering them a product that they might have. Christian, is there anything in terms of the behavior or the buying behavior that we can talk about in terms of buying online versus in a store? Have you come across any research that suggests we behave differently, or we're changing the way that we consume stuff?
So look, I think there are, one of the key things is that physical purchasing involves going and you have a sense of buying from you look at the building you're purchasing from and the brand reputation of the organization. What we've seen in recent years is as people go online, obviously the barriers to entry to setting up an online presence are pretty limited. And so we've had lots of examples of people setting stores up. And in fact, you can buy all the software in. So anyone on this call could set up an online store right now. But what we've seen is the same dynamics that we saw in the physical world also played out in the digital world. So the Amazons of this world, yes, they've done well because they've expanded the range of products. They've provided great service, but there's also brand recognition there. And so we've seen a lot of people building brands online using the same dynamics that you would see in the real physical world. And so on the face of it, it seems like it's a completely different beast. But actually, we tend to operate on the same basis. And we've all got a lot wiser about operating online. And I think one of the things that's interesting about the education market online is it's probably in those early stages where we can sort of see the potential. And if you go back 15 years, we could all see the potential for e-commerce, and maybe even more than that, maybe 20 years. You see the potential for e-commerce, but it was in the early formative stages. And then Amazon came along and everybody sort of laughed at the idea of a bookstore, and look where that's gone. So I think there's an interesting time now, and I would draw serious analogies between other businesses that have taken themselves online and gone through a sort of learning process where there's been new entrants coming in very early on. And if you look at retail, there were lots of, boo.com, and if people remember that, it was an attempt to put fashion online. Everybody laughed about it. Now, nobody thinks twice about buying fashion online. They were arguably a little bit ahead of their time. But the same dynamics that we've seen in the physical world occur in the online world. And as you were talking, Mark, I was thinking, well, who can we learn from that's taken a localized product with a regulatory environment around it and exported it globally? And the best example I could come up with was the BBC. That had a remit to provide television and radio services in the UK. And they turned themselves into this global operation using that respective brand. Now they had the World Service to help build that but they've gone into all sorts of different areas globally, starting with that UK presence and using that known brand. And so I think there's an opportunity here for people to look at it and say, we need to experiment a little bit, but we need to recognize there's going to be a land grab. And you've pointed out there are people there already, but just because you're not a first mover doesn't mean you don't have the opportunity to catch up. You just need a strategy. And so I think, this is a really interesting time to be having this discussion because we're all sort of seeing who's emerging and everybody's peering into this space, but we all recognize the potential. Just the other day, I was on a webinar, I joined a webinar from India. Minutes later, I was in Singapore doing something, and then I joined an American one later in the day. And, that seems perfect. Did I notice any particular difference? The accents changed slightly, but it was very easy for me to do. So there's clearly the potential to deliver this. And I think strong brands, if they get this right, have a real opportunity to do it. But that doesn't also mean that new entrants can't do an Amazon-type entry into the space if they've thought it through carefully.
Thanks, Christian. I just want to pick up something you were saying there about the BBC, to use that as an example. And of course, in the UK, we're lucky in that we have some extremely strong educational brands, for want of a better word, which are to an extent already going out and doing that kind of exporting that the questioner was asking about. Certainly a lot of the very high grade independent schools in this country, like Eton and Harrow and Winchester, have strong links with international communities in terms of bringing pupils from there to study here, but they also have relationships with institutions abroad, and they are working towards, and I think this is an inevitability over the next 10 years, they're working towards, I think, a much more international footprint in terms of being able to provide education. I think we're also lucky in the university sector in the UK because for all that we are a relatively small country, we have some of the unassailable brands. Obviously, we have Oxford, Cambridge, but we have St Andrews, we have UCL, we have Imperial, we have universities which are international big hitters and which do establish relationships with institutions abroad. But I think they can probably do more than that. I think they would like to do more than that. And I think the opportunity of this blank canvas, which COVID has suggested, is going to be a way for them to do that. We've certainly got time for one more question, and it's quite a blunt one, really, but I think it focuses the mind quite nicely. Who are going to be the winners and losers in education from COVID? Christian, you look like you might have some thoughts.
So I think I come back to what I said before, which is I think it's going to be too early to tell, because I think this is currently, things are shaking out at the moment. And so I think it's, traditional logic would say that if I have a strong brand for my physical education product, that I will be able to build a strong brand online. But we've seen plenty of examples of traditional, look at retail. You would think that some of the retailers would have been able to pivot to this. Some of them have managed it well, some of them have managed it less well, and some of them are no longer around. And I think it's a very, very difficult thing to call. I think there is an opportunity for brands that are well established to do well. It's an opportunity for them to screw it up as well. But there's also an opportunity, I think, for new entrants. So I think anybody that is making accurate predictions now is playing a very dangerous game, because I think we just don't know. And I think also, to Mark's point earlier, consumers think they know what they want at the moment. But that is a consumer that is looking at the products that are currently available. And I'm very struck by the sort of Steve Jobs iPhone logic that says if you'd asked people what they wanted, they would have told you they wanted a phone with a keyboard. And everybody laughed at the iPhone as a concept, Nokia and BlackBerry, great examples. So I think there's room there for consumers to change what they want. So consumers will see other products that they like the look of, and so people will they'll copy things that are out there already. But I think there's a great potential for new ways of learning and new things that nobody's thought of yet that could become hugely dominant in the future. They just haven't been permitted by the existing structures. So I'm not going to make any predictions beyond to say I think we're in for a really interesting ride.
Thanks, Christian. I think it goes back really to Henry Ford's maxim, doesn't it? If I'd asked my customers what they wanted, they'd have said a faster horse. I would go a little bit further than you, but probably not too much further, because I'm conscious of needing a bit of caution. But I think in terms of winners and losers, I think the potential winners are in two categories. There are those who have strong brands, as Christian said, like the big universities of the Russell Group or the Ivy League or some of the other Commonwealth universities. But I think among those, it's going to be the institutions which get it, if you like, who see the possibilities of pivoting, of altering their way of delivering what they have to give, but who also, I think, had the bravery to do it, because this is a difficult time for everyone across every sector. There are difficult choices to be made, and I think those who see opportunities and are willing to take a punt are going to succeed. I think the other category of potential winners are going to be the great disruptors. I mean, in the university sector in the UK, we have one private university, we have the University of Buckingham, which has lasted for decades now on the basis of its private status. And it did come along as a disruptor to the field. And I think those institutions or people who create institutions yet to be are going to have enormous opportunities if, again, they can be brave enough and resourceful enough to get it. In terms of losers, I think there is going to be a reckoning in financial terms. I think that's an unpleasant reality of education, because none of us wants to think of education as a competition of who has the biggest wallet, but fundamentally that's always going to be a part of the calculation. And I think institutions who are currently existing on very marginal balance sheets are going to find the environment more difficult, and I think some of them will probably not see the end of the crisis in the way that, as Christian said, some retailers haven't, and in wider business terms, that some huge companies haven't. I mean, we've all seen closures in the UK, in the US, across the world, and I think there are going to be some perhaps quite shocking departures from the field. But I don't think I would go further into the crystal ball than that. But Mark, do you want to add anything on that?
I mean, I would agree with a lot of that. I think the potential for there to be somebody that comes completely out of nowhere is very, very high. Again, that was always true in any particular industry. The notion of money is a fascinating one, and what happens to that. And sadly, it may well be that the institutions that don't have the funds they deserve, and you may argue that no institution has the funds that it needs, have a particular problem. But I think the losers will definitely be those that don't take the opportunity to think about the problems they already have and the opportunities that exist in the future, not just in the traditional academic sense, but in the notion of education as it exists for a whole of life relationship with a customer. So I think if you don't at least take a step back now and look at what you've been doing, the chances are that you will have some form of problem further down the line. You may get lucky, and I hope that everyone gets lucky, because we need a bit of luck in the world. But I think you set yourself up for failure if you don't, on a repeated basis, just challenge and kick the tires on every aspect of your product and what your consumer is telling you they want about their product, insofar as they are able to do that. But yeah, other than that, we don't know. But now is the time to be looking at all of those issues.
Thanks very much, Mark. Well, I'm conscious it's coming up to the hour mark, so I think we'll close there. Thanks to everyone who signed in. I hope you've got something out of it. I hope you've got some questions in your mind which you will take back to your institutions or to your experiences, wherever they may be in this country, around the world. I know we've got some people from far-flung places from London. But we'll close it there. We thank you very much for joining us. If you want to know any more about Pivot Point, we do have a website, www.pivotpoint.group. And we're also on Twitter at pivotpoint__. So if you want to pick up any questions immediately or later on this evening as things occur to you, please do go on to the Twitter account. We'll certainly make it our business to lurk and pick up some of the questions that you may have, or observations, feedback, things that have occurred to you. And as I said at the beginning, we will be discussing some of these points further in a series of podcasts which will appear over the next few weeks. But again, I think also it's a topic which is going to be evergreen. I think education is a sector which is going to be transforming itself over the next 10 years. So I'm sure we will have plenty to talk about over the coming months and perhaps years. So this won't be the last offering we have for the sector, and we will try to engage yet further with practitioners and customers across the sector. So if I can just say thank you to my colleagues Mark and Christian, and thank you to everyone who has joined us. I think we'll call it quits there. That's just over an hour, but thank you all for watching, and we hope to be in further contact with you soon. Goodbye.
Thank you.